Snyder Avenue in South Philadelphia is a street that the city of Philadelphia long ago stopped paying attention to in the way it pays attention to streets that matter. It is a block of modest two-story brick row houses, the kind of housing that working class immigrant families built their entire lives inside and never left. The kind of street where the front steps are scrubbed and the curtains are drawn tight, and neighbors know each other's business, and nothing, from the outside, appears to distinguish one house from another. Number 934 is a three-bedroom house with wrought iron railings running up the cement steps to the front door, the first home the man inside it ever owned, a detail he mentioned when people asked what the house meant to him. On the evening of March 21st, 1980, a 1979 maroon Chevrolet Classic Caprice stopped along the curb on Snyder Avenue, approximately 25 feet from those steps. The front wheels turned toward the street as though the car had simply paused rather than fully parked. Two men were inside. The man in the passenger seat reached for a cigarette. Someone, according to at least one account, rolled the window down. Two men appeared from the rear. Two shots were fired. The man in the passenger seat was struck once, behind the right ear, by a single shotgun blast. He died instantly. His body remained upright, the way bodies sometimes remain when there is no interval between the living and the dead. His name was Angelo Bruno, and he had been the most powerful figure in the Philadelphia underworld for 21 years, and he was 69 years old, and the wound behind his ear was a gaping hole that the chief inspector of detectives on the scene described as indicating the use of something considerably heavier than a pistol. The man in the driver's seat was alive. He had pellet wounds to his right forearm and wrist. He would be taken to St. Agnes Hospital and listed in satisfactory condition. He told police that two men had appeared from nowhere and fired through the window and run west on Snyder Avenue before splitting off. He said he could not describe them, except that they were white. The radio message went out across the Philadelphia police frequency at 9:50 that night. Shooting at 934 Snyder Avenue, one homicide, one man wounded. The address was familiar to hundreds of officers. The man wounded was the driver. And what law enforcement would spend the following years trying to establish was whether the man who walked away had opened the window. Drop where you are watching from in the comments below. It is one of the genuinely interesting parts of telling these stories, finding out where in the world they reach. If you are new here and want more history like this, subscribe and it will come directly to you. Back to Snyder Avenue and the question of what the man in the driver's seat actually was. Angelo Bruno had been boss of the Philadelphia crime family since 1959, and the 20 years that followed his appointment were, by the standards of the industry he ran, something close to a prolonged era of institutional calm. Bruno was not born Angelo Bruno. He was born Angelo Annaloro on May 21, 1910, in Villalba, in the province of Caltanissetta in western Sicily, the son of a foundry worker whose family would eventually settle in South Philadelphia. He dropped the name Annaloro at some point in his early criminal career and replaced it with his paternal grandmother's maiden name, a decision that erased the documentary connection between his current life and the family record he had been born into. He was married to Assunta Maranca, known to everyone as Sue, from 1931 until the night he died. They had two children, Michael and Gion. His home on Snyder Avenue was his first owned property. He ran a small extermination company and an aluminum products business through entirely legitimate channels, as many men in his position maintained legitimate cover operations, though the money that funded the life he lived came from a different set of activities entirely. What Bruno had built was an organization that generated between $50 and $100 million annually across gambling, loansharking, labor racketeering, and port operations. He controlled significant portions of the Philadelphia waterfront, the unions that governed the construction trades, and the numbers rackets that ran through South Philadelphia and across the river into South Jersey. He maintained a seat on the Commission, the national governing body of the American Cosa Nostra, and he used that seat with the same diplomatic precision he brought to every other aspect of his professional life. His relationship with Carlo Gambino of the New York Gambino family, the most powerful single figure in the national hierarchy during the 1960s and into the 1970s, was the cornerstone of his external standing. Gambino and Bruno spoke regularly. Their alliance was not merely transactional, it was, by the accounts of those who observed it from within the organizational world, something closer to genuine personal regard between two men who recognized in each other the same preference for order over chaos. Bruno had earned his nickname, the Gentle Don, through a sustained and deliberate practice of restraint. He resolved disputes through negotiation rather than violence where possible. He exiled the soldier Nicodemo Scarfo to Atlantic City because he considered Scarfo too volatile for the city's operations, a banishment that would eventually have consequences nobody fully anticipated at the moment it was ordered. He maintained the long-standing Cosa Nostra prohibition against narcotics dealing, at least in its public form, and he enforced it vocally. Behind that public position, a more complicated arrangement existed. Certain members of the organization's inner circle, including a group of Sicilian relatives connected to the Gambino family, who had been permitted to establish operations in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, conducted narcotics business with Bruno's knowledge and, the record suggests, with a share of the proceeds flowing to the organization's treasury. The official position and the actual practice occupied two different registers, and the distance between them was a source of quiet resentment among members who were prohibited from profiting directly while watching others do precisely that. The organization Bruno ran was not an organization defined by spectacle. It was an organization defined by function. The men within it were employed and earning. The relationships with political figures, law enforcement officials, and institutional structures that governed everyday life in Philadelphia were managed with care and consistency. When something went wrong, Bruno preferred to fix it with a conversation before reaching for any more drastic resolution. For 2 decades, that approach produced a family that was, by the internal measures the Commission used to evaluate its constituent organizations, stable, profitable, and manageable. The Commission saw Bruno as a reliable voice. Other bosses brought disputes to him for resolution. He was, in the language of that world, a man of respect. But the world Bruno had built was not a sealed system, and the forces working against it were not all outside the organization. Giovanni Stanfa was born on December 7th, 1940, in the Sicilian town of Caccamo, a community in the hills above Palermo, where the presence of organized criminal networks in the social fabric was not a secret and not an anomaly, but simply one of the organizing facts of daily life. His older brothers were involved in those networks. The family's criminal connections ran through the local Mafia clans that dominated the area and extended, through the migration patterns of post-war Sicily, into the Italian-American communities in New York and New Jersey that had been built by the same generation of Sicilian immigrants who had brought their organizational customs with them across the Atlantic. Stanfa emigrated to the United States in 1964 at the age of 23. He listed his occupation on the immigration documents as bricklayer, and that description was not entirely false. He was a man who worked with his hands, who understood masonry and construction, and who would later, in an irony the record does not comment on, do brickwork on the South Philadelphia home of the man who would give him his most consequential employment. He married Nicolena Congialdi the same year he arrived and settled in New York City with his wife, where his brothers and his brother-in-law were already established. Those brothers and that brother-in-law were made members of the Gambino crime family. They introduced Stanfa to the organization. Through those connections, Stanfa was eventually introduced to Carlo Gambino himself, the undisputed patriarch of New York organized crime in that era, the man whose relationships extended across every significant family in the national structure. Gambino had a specific use for a Sicilian-born craftsman with the right family background and the right connections. Angelo Bruno in Philadelphia needed trustworthy men close to him, and Gambino had a preference for placing men he knew in positions adjacent to the bosses he was allied with. The arrangement served multiple purposes simultaneously. Stanfa relocated to Philadelphia with his family in the late 1960s. He was assigned to Bruno as a personal driver and bodyguard. He was inducted as a made member of the Philadelphia family, The man from Cacamo was now the man who sat closest to the boss, and that position in the organization Angelo Bruno ran meant something. By the middle of the 1970s, the stability Angelo Bruno had built for 15 years was beginning to show its first visible cracks, and those cracks had a specific shape. In 1976, the state of New Jersey legalized casino gambling. Atlantic City, a boardwalk resort town that had been in economic decline for decades, suddenly became the most important new criminal territory on the East Coast. Atlantic City was geographically and historically within the Philadelphia family's domain. South Jersey had been Bruno's territory for as long as he had been boss. The question of who would control the labor unions, the construction contracts, the service industries, and eventually the gambling floors of the casinos themselves was, by any calculation any organized crime figure could make in 1976, the most consequential territorial question of the decade. Bruno's response was characteristic of everything he was. He moved cautiously. He preferred to negotiate access for other families, rather than seize the territory aggressively and fight to hold it. He believed the income from controlled, managed relationships was more reliable and more sustainable than the income from contested ground. The younger men within the organization did not see it that way. They saw an enormous amount of money not being made, and they believed their boss's caution was the reason it was not being made. The same year Atlantic City's legalization changed the map of the Eastern criminal economy. Carlo Gambino died of a heart attack on October 15th, 1976. He was 74 years old. He had been the most powerful single figure in the American Cosa Nostra for 2 decades, and his relationship with Bruno had been the most important external protection Bruno possessed. With Gambino gone, that protection was gone too. A new generation of Gambino leadership had its own concerns and its own internal politics, and the relationship between Philadelphia and New York did not carry the same personal weight it had carried when the two bosses had known each other for 30 years. The man within Bruno's organization who watched all of this most carefully was Antonio Rocco Caponigro. His nickname was Tony Bananas, a name that traced its origin to his father's banana wholesale business, and Caponigro had been operating in the ironbound neighborhood of Newark, New Jersey since the 1950s. He controlled a numbers operation in Newark, a holdover from the period when the New York families had ceded parts of North Jersey to Philadelphia as part of a territorial arrangement that Bruno had negotiated and maintained. Caponigro was the consigliere, the third-ranking position in the family's formal hierarchy, and he had spent years developing his own view of what the organization should be doing and arriving at the conclusion that its current boss was standing in the way. He traveled to New York to consult with Frank Thierry of the Genovese crime family. The Genovese organization had a specific interest in Atlantic City territory that Bruno was not sharing and that the current arrangement did not permit them to access directly. Thierry's response to Caponigro's approach, whatever its exact content, was interpreted by Caponigro as indicating that the Commission would look favorably on a change in Philadelphia's leadership. Caponigro heard what he wanted to hear. He returned to Philadelphia having convinced himself that an authority above Bruno had authorized the next step. What the Commission would later rule, categorically, was that Thierry had authorized nothing, that the Commission had not been consulted, and that the murder of a Commission member without Commission sanction was a violation that carried its own inevitable consequence. By the time Caponigro assembled the elements of what he had planned, the man closest to Bruno was already in the picture. Stanfa drove Bruno. Stanfa knew Bruno's schedule, his habits, his regular restaurants, the route from dinner to the house on Snyder Avenue. Law enforcement believed, and some accounts state directly, that Stanfa's role in what followed was to provide access, to position the car at the right moment, and to signal that the moment had arrived. The record does not establish his involvement with the certainty a conviction requires. He was never charged with the murder itself. But what the record does establish through a federal court's finding is that he lied to a grand jury about where he went in the days immediately after the killing. South Philadelphia, 9:50 in the evening on March 21st, 1980. Earlier that night, Angelo Bruno had eaten dinner at Cusa's Little Italy at 11th and Christian Streets, a restaurant he favored and visited regularly, where the staff knew him and where he would sometimes request a table in the rear, away from the windows in the street. His dinner companions that evening were Jacob Kosman, his attorney, and Raymond Martirano, known as Long John, one of his lieutenants. The three of them sat down at approximately 7 in the evening and stayed somewhat more than 2 hours. John Stanfa was also in the restaurant that night. When Bruno, Kosman, and Martirano prepared to leave, Bruno turned to Stanfa and asked him to drive him home. They walked out to Stanfa's car, the maroon Chevrolet Classic Caprice, and drove first to the newsstand on the northwest corner of Broad Street and Snyder Avenue, where Bruno got out to buy a newspaper, then returned to the front passenger seat. Stanfa turned east onto Snyder Avenue. Bruno's home was slightly more than 4 blocks away. The street was quiet in the way that South Philadelphia residential streets are quiet on a Friday evening when the dinner hour has ended and the neighborhood has settled into its private rhythms. Stanfa stopped the car in the nearest available space along the curb. The vehicle sat approximately 25 feet from the wrought iron railings at the steps leading to Bruno's front door. It was positioned about 7 feet from the curb, with the front wheels turned toward the street rather than fully parallel to it, as though the car had simply halted rather than been properly parked. The window beside Bruno was rolled down. The explanation offered to investigators was that Bruno had wanted to discard a cigarette. Law enforcement sources described this detail with a different interpretation. The window being down when the car stopped at night in front of the house where Bruno lived provided an unobstructed line from the street directly to the side of the boss's head. Whether the window was rolled down at Bruno's request or for some other reason is not established in any surviving court record. It is one of the details that falls into the space between what investigators believed and what they could prove. 2 men appeared from the rear of the car as it stopped. 2 shots were fired through the open window. Bruno was struck once by a single shotgun blast behind his right ear. He was dead instantly. The wound left a gaping hole. His body remained seated upright in the passenger seat, the newspaper in the car beside him, the cigarette wherever it had gone. Stanfa suffered pellet wounds to his right forearm and wrist. Police would later note that neither Stanfa nor Bruno had been carrying weapons at the time of the shooting. Stanfa was taken to St. Agnes Hospital, approximately a mile from the house on Snyder Avenue, and listed in satisfactory condition. The crowd gathered on Snyder Avenue quickly. Police erected barricades on both sides of the block to manage the onlookers. The body of Angelo Bruno remained in the car for approximately an hour while the chief inspector of detectives, Frank Scafidi, told reporters that moving it before the scene had been fully documented was not possible. When he was asked whether the killing appeared to have been a contract murder, Scafidi's answer was direct. "It looks like that to me." When asked whether someone had succeeded in silencing Angelo Bruno permanently, his answer was equally direct. They succeeded. Bruno's daughter Jean would say, decades later, that every time she left the house on Snyder Avenue, she could see the exact spot on the curb where her father had died. The driver's account, delivered to police at the scene and then to investigators in the days that followed, described 2 men appearing suddenly, 2 shots, and the men running west on Snyder Avenue toward the intersection with 10th Street, where Stanfa believed they separated. He could offer no physical description beyond that they were white. He had heard shots and watched them flee. He had not been able to identify either man. The immediate reaction within law enforcement was skepticism that found a specific focus. A man sitting in the passenger seat of a stopped car, at close range and in poor light, shot once in the head with a shotgun. That man does not survive. The driver sitting immediately adjacent to him sustains pellet wounds to the forearm and wrist and is otherwise uninjured. The wound pattern on the driver, minor and peripheral, was consistent, either with the scatter of a single shotgun discharge at close range or with what would happen if the shooter knew which man in the car was the target and which man in the car was not. The window being down was consistent either with a man discarding a cigarette on a cool March night or with a man who had agreed to indicate the moment at which the car was stopped and the target was ready. Neither interpretation could be ruled out by the physical evidence. Neither interpretation could be established by it. Stanfa appeared before the federal grand jury investigating Bruno's murder on two occasions. At the second appearance, on April the 21st, 1980, investigators asked him whether he had ever traveled with Frank Sindone or with John Simone to New York City. He denied it. This denial was what would eventually land him in federal court. What the prosecution subsequently established was that on March the 27th, 1980, 6 days after the murder on Snyder Avenue, John Stanfa had traveled to Newark, New Jersey with Frank Sindone. The following day, March the 28th, he continued to New York City with Sindone and remained there through that day. The question of why Bruno's driver had traveled to New York with associates of the organization within a week of the boss's murder was not answered in the courtroom, where Stanfa eventually faced perjury charges. The charges addressed only whether he had told the truth about the trip, not what purpose the trip had served. On that narrower question, the jury found him guilty on both counts. After his second grand jury appearance, Stanfa disappeared. The Gambino family, whose connections to Stanfa predated his arrival in Philadelphia and had never been dissolved, provided him with cover. For approximately 8 months, he was not where law enforcement was looking. In December of 1980, he was found in Baltimore, Maryland, working as a baker in a pizza shop, having adopted a version of everyday obscurity that the criminal world has always offered to men who need to be invisible for a time. He was arrested and returned to Philadelphia. Bail was set at $1 million. In April of 1981, he was convicted of 2 counts of making false declarations before a grand jury. The sentence was 5 years on the first count and 3 years on the second, to run consecutively. He served approximately 6 years before his release. He went to prison for lying about a trip to New York, while the more consequential question, the one about what the rolled-down window meant, remained officially unanswered. Less than 4 weeks after Bruno died on Snyder Avenue, the commission had finished deliberating on what Tony Bananas Caponegro had done. Caponegro was summoned to New York under the pretense of a meeting at which he presumably believed his new position in the Philadelphia hierarchy would be discussed and formalized. He had murdered the boss of one of the commission's member families. He believed, based on his reading of his conversations with Frank Thierry, that this murder had been authorized at the level that counted. What he encountered when he arrived was something entirely different. He was told directly that the murder had not been considered by the commission, let alone sanctioned. He turned to Thierry, who was present at the meeting. He identified Thierry as the man who had given him the authorization he believed he held. Thierry denied it, categorically and completely. He did not know what Caponegro was talking about. He had not authorized anything. Caponegro had murdered a commission member based on what he had convinced himself was approval from a man who now had no memory of giving any such approval. The commission's ruling was not complicated. He had violated the rule that existed above all other rules, and the penalty for that violation was the same penalty that had always applied. On April 18th, 1980, the bodies of Antonio Caponegro and his brother-in-law Alfred Salerno were found in the trunk of a stolen car in the South Bronx. Both men were nude. Both had sustained multiple gunshot wounds, knife wounds, and severe beating. Caponegro's body bore 14 bullet wounds alone. Torn $20 bills had been crammed into the orifices of both bodies. The symbolism required no translation for anyone familiar with the language the commission used when it needed to make a point. Caponegro had been killed for greed, and the money stuffed into his body was the commission's way of making that point concrete and permanent and visible. The commission named Philip Testa as Bruno's successor, and Testa walked into an inheritance of violence he had not created and could not contain. Philip Testa, who carried the nickname the Chicken Man from his involvement in a legitimate poultry business, had been born on April 21st, 1924, and had served as Bruno's underboss and, by several accounts, his closest friend within the organization. The transition from Bruno to Testa was smooth in one sense. The commission approved it, the family accepted it, and Testa assumed command without internal challenge. The deeper problems were not addressed by the transfer of authority. The resentments that had allowed Caponegro to assemble co-conspirators had not been eliminated by Caponegro's death. The organization Bruno had held together through 21 years of careful management was now a family whose boss had been murdered by his own consigliere, whose consigliere had been murdered by the commission in retribution, and whose structural integrity was in question in ways that no single appointment could resolve. Testa lasted less than 11 months. On March 15th, 1981, he returned to his home at 2117 Porter Street in South Philadelphia in the early morning hours. As he was opening the front door, a nail bomb planted beneath the porch exploded. The blast was powerful enough that neighbors in the surrounding blocks initially believed an industrial accident had occurred somewhere nearby. Debris flew across the street and into the grounds of Stephen Girard Park on the opposite side of Porter. The porch roof collapsed. The front door was blown approximately 15 feet into the interior of the house. Testa was found alive on the far side of a crater, punched through the concrete floor of the porch, his lower body destroyed. He was rushed to St. Agnes Hospital and died at 4:15 in the morning. The assassination was allegedly ordered by his own underboss, Peter Casella, and his capo Frank Naducci Sr. Two bosses of the Philadelphia crime family had been murdered inside of 1 year. The violence that followed was not the end of that pattern. It was closer to the beginning of it. Nicodemo Scarfo, the man Bruno had once exiled to Atlantic City for being too volatile, emerged from that exile as the dominant candidate to assume command. He became boss of the Philadelphia family and remained in that position from 1981 through 1990. During those 9 years, the organization he ran was responsible for more than 30 murders. The men who had conspired against Testa were killed or driven out. Scarfo brought the same methodology to every problem: violence, deployed swiftly and extensively, as both solution and deterrent. The family became known in those years as one of the most internally destructive organizations in the national structure, killing its own members at a pace that no external prosecution could have matched for sheer organizational damage. Federal prosecutions arrived in the late 1980s. Scarfo and the senior members of his administration were indicted, tried, and convicted. Scarfo received a sentence of 69 years. His own nephew, Phil Leonetti, who had served as his underboss, testified against him as a cooperating government witness. By the time Scarfo's conviction was final, the Philadelphia family that Angelo Bruno had built into one of the most stable and profitable criminal organizations in the country had consumed itself so completely that its continued existence as a functioning entity was, by any realistic assessment, in genuine doubt. The man who drove the maroon Chevrolet on Snyder Avenue did not appear in any major account of those war years. He was in prison, serving his time for the perjury conviction, and the organization he had entered as a driver and bodyguard was destroying itself without his participation. The years after his release from prison, approximately 1987, were marked by deliberate and careful obscurity. John Stanfa maintained a visible everyday life as a legitimate businessman. He joined one of his sons in operating a food importing and distribution business. He ran a food distribution warehouse in southwest Philadelphia. He attended to ordinary commercial matters. He did not attract attention. What was happening below the surface of that ordinary life was something different. The five families of New York, and the Gambino family specifically, had been watching Philadelphia descend into chaos through the Scarfo years, and they had a specific view about what was needed when Scarfo's conviction removed him from command. They wanted stability. They wanted someone with old world credentials, someone who carried the Sicilian tradition rather than the street fighter tradition that the Scarfo years had produced, someone whose connection to the Gambino organization was established and trusted. The man they identified was the food distributor in southwest Philadelphia. Around 1991, with Gambino backing and the formal endorsement of the five families, John Stanfa was designated the boss of the Philadelphia crime family. He had arrived in Philadelphia in the late 1960s as a driver. He had been present at the murder of the boss he served. He had served a federal sentence for lying about what he did in the days after the killing. He had spent years in productive obscurity. And now, More than a decade after the night on Snyder Avenue, he was the man the New York families trusted to run the organization that had once been run by the man he had driven home from dinner. His style was consistent with his background and with what the Gambino family wanted from him. He was low profile, quiet, traditional in the methods he employed, and deliberate in the way he moved. He operated from his food distribution warehouse. He maintained the appearance of a working businessman. He preferred the old Sicilian approach: silence, discipline, patience. He did not seek publicity. He was, in those respects, closer to the model of Bruno than to the model of anyone who had led the family in the intervening decade. The organization he inherited was not the organization Bruno had commanded. It was fractured, depleted, internally suspicious, and populated at its younger levels by men who had grown up in the Scarfo era and had no particular loyalty to the traditions Stanfa embodied. Among those men was Joseph Merlino, known as Skinny Joey, who represented a faction of younger members who believed the future of the organization belonged to them and not to an old-school Sicilian whose authority had been conferred by New York rather than earned in the streets of South Philadelphia. The war between Stanfa and Merlino began with the killing of Felix Bocchino, a Stanfa ally, on January 29, 1992. Stanfa attempted a diplomatic resolution. He inducted Merlino and his closest associate, Michael Chiancalini, as made members of the family. The theory was that formal membership would bring the younger faction inside the structure where it could be managed and, if necessary, eliminated. The theory did not survive contact with the reality of what Merlino's faction was willing to do. By 1993, the war was open and violent. On August 5th of that year, Stanfa's faction organized a drive-by shooting targeting Merlino and Chiancalini outside their South Philadelphia clubhouse. Merlino survived. 2 bullets to the buttocks, a wound that kept him in the hospital and away from the street but did not remove him from the conflict. Chiancalini was shot in the chest and died from his wounds. He was 31 years old. 26 days later, on August 31st, 1993, it was Stanfa's turn. He and his son were in a vehicle on the Schuylkill Expressway when a drive-by shooting targeted the car. Stanfa escaped uninjured. His son was shot in the jaw and near the eye and survived, though the wound was serious and the recovery long. The man who had been next to Bruno on Snyder Avenue when the shotgun went off had now been next to his own son when gunmen opened fire on the expressway and had survived both encounters without a fatal wound. The organizational logic of the war increasingly required a level of violence that was pulling men from both factions toward federal attention rather than away from it. Stanfa responded by ordering systematic violence against members of the Merlino faction. On January 14, 1994, John Veazey, an enforcer who had served Stanfa as a hitman, was lured to an apartment building in South Philadelphia where he was shot 3 times in the head and once in the chest. Veazey survived. He wrestled a knife from one of the men sent to kill him and escaped the building. Within months, he was cooperating with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. John Veazey took everything he knew with him, and what he knew was enough. On March 17, 1994, John Stanfa and 20 of his associates were indicted on charges including labor racketeering, extortion, loansharking, murder, and conspiracy to commit murder. The indictment was built on the intelligence Veazey had provided and on the surveillance operation the FBI had been running against the organization. The trial was scheduled to begin on October 5, 1995. On that morning, before testimony could begin, William Veazey, John Veazey's older brother, was murdered. The killing was understood immediately as an attempt to discourage John Veazey from testifying. He testified anyway. The trial ran 7 weeks. More than 40 witnesses appeared for the prosecution. The government introduced 178 intercepted telephone conversations in which Stanfa directed criminal operations, discussed murder contracts, and managed the affairs of the organization with the full clarity and operational precision of a man who was doing exactly what the prosecution charged him with doing. The recordings left no ambiguity about his authority or his awareness of what was being done in his name. John Veazey described in specific detail the murders he had committed and attempted on Stanfa's orders, the organizational structure Stanfa maintained, and the way decisions about violence moved through the chain of command. He described what it had been like to be a hired instrument of a boss who communicated his instructions with the cold efficiency of someone who had been managing men for a long time. On November 21st, 1995, the jury returned a verdict, guilty on 33 of the 35 charges. On July 9th, 1996, the sentence was handed down, 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The charges encompassed 4 murders, 7 attempted murders, and a kidnapping, among other offenses. John Stanfa, born in Caccamo, Sicily, on December 7th, 1940, who had arrived in the United States as a bricklayer in 1964, who had driven Angelo Bruno home from dinner on a Friday night in 1980 and walked away from the scene with pellet wounds to his arm, who had lied to a federal grand jury about a trip to New York 6 days later, who had served a prison sentence and operated a food distribution business and been installed as boss of the Philadelphia crime family by New York families, who trusted his Sicilian credentials, who had fought a war against the younger generation of his own organization and lost it to the government while the war was still ongoing, would spend the remainder of his life in federal custody. As of the time of this writing, he is 84 years old and incarcerated at the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut. The story of what the murder of Angelo Bruno set in motion is, on one reading, a story about the destruction of an institution. The Philadelphia crime family had been, under Bruno's management, one of the most stable and disciplined criminal organizations in the national structure. In the 20 years after his death, it destroyed its own leadership repeatedly, consumed itself in internal wars, submitted to federal prosecution in successive waves, and lost the territorial authority and financial power it had accumulated over his 21-year tenure. 3 bosses were murdered in under 2 years. The 4th was imprisoned for the rest of his life. The 5th fought a war against his own organization's younger members and received 5 consecutive life sentences for what that war produced. The Genovese family of New York, which by most accounts had a hand through Thierry in encouraging Caponegro to believe the commission would accept what it never had any intention of accepting, emerged as one of the primary beneficiaries of Philadelphia's chaos. By 1982, after backing Scarfo's claim to the boss position, the Genovese organization had received permission to operate in Atlantic City, the territory that Bruno had refused to share, and that had been one of the engines of the resentment driving the conspiracy against him. The city Bruno had tried to protect through careful relationship management became, after his death, a prize distributed to the family, whose fingerprints on his murder were never documented in a way that produced a conviction. Bruno's daughter Jean continued to live in the 3-bedroom row house at 934 Snyder Avenue for decades after her father's death. In a 2010 interview, when the house was briefly offered for sale, she described what it was like to live there. Every time she came outside, she said, she could see the exact spot on the curb where he had been killed. She was asked whether she believed John Stanfa had been involved in the murder. She said she did not. The driver served more time in federal prison than he spent driving Angelo Bruno to and from dinner. He walked away from Snyder Avenue with pellet wounds to the arm. He lied to a grand jury about a trip. He waited out the years of violence in productive obscurity. He was handed an organization to run and ran it into the ground in a war he could not win. And he has been in federal custody, across one institution and another, since his conviction in 1995, in the same federal prison system that holds the records of what he did and what he said into the government's telephones, and what he ordered done to the men who worked for him and then refused to. The question that was never answered in a courtroom was whether the window rolled down on a cool Friday night in March 1980 because Angelo Bruno had a cigarette he wanted to discard, or because the man in the driver's seat had agreed to make clear that the car had stopped and the moment had arrived. The bodies of Tony Bananas Caponegro and his brother-in-law were found in a trunk in the Bronx with torn money pressed into their flesh, a message about what greed costs when it overreaches. The driver lived for another 45 years without being required to give any answer at all.